Joining us, former federal prosecutor and senior national security official at the Department of Justice, David Laufman. David, a lot of talk today. Good to see you, by the way. It's been a while. A lot of talk about January 6th and what happened on that day. I think you're on mute, so check your computer. There was an attempt to reframe the day, to rewrite what happened that day, to say that these were not, in some cases, they were not, inspired by Donald Trump or that they were peaceful protesters. They weren't really trying to overturn the election. You understand these cases. Tell me what happened.
Look, I think Jack Smith today acquitted himself as a quintessential Justice Department career lawyer. He responded as best he could to questions that were mostly theatrical in nature. What I know about the department, what I know about the people that brought these cases, investigated them, some of whom were former colleagues of mine, is they did precisely as Jack Smith described today. They applied Department of Justice policy, of longstanding policy. They applied the law. They got court-authorized warrants when they needed it. And they did all this methodically and meticulously and with the sober, prudential kind of thoughtfulness that we want in Justice Department prosecutors, precisely the opposite of what we're seeing now in the weaponization of the department and the demolition of career prosecutors in the FBI. So this isn't the kind of forum, as Leslie Caldwell pointed out, that lends itself to, a tremendously informative public education. But I think he did the best he could to lay out the strength of his case, his view, which he advanced as an officer of the court, that they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt the charges brought in the January 6th case and the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case.
I wonder, though, I understand that Jack Smith is a stoic guy. I understand that he's not made for politics. He's made for the courtroom, not made for TV, made for the courtroom. But he is entering into the public sphere. It's the nature of it when you're asked to testify. And he clearly believes that what he did to investigating the president was necessary and important. He said so himself. He said, without this, we're going to lose credibility. And this is a president that tried to overturn the election. Do you think that because of that, maybe the strategy could have been different or maybe could have been better for him to be a little bit more forceful in presenting his own case and the evidence that he gathered?
Well, unless you've ever been in the witness chair in a congressional hearing, it's hard to really understand the dynamic of what it is like to respond to questions in that environment. There were times where I would have preferred that he counterpunch a little more assertively, maybe acerbically. He did stand up for his people on many occasions. I was glad about that. But it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of a witness. I think had he expressed more anger or indignation, it might have played politically into the hands of Republicans as well as the sitting president of the United States, who want to characterize him as just an angry, Trump deranged individual who should not be credited.
Let me play again what Jack Smith expects regarding the president.
Do you believe that President Trump's Department of Justice will find some way to indict you?
I believe that they will do everything in their power to do that because they've been ordered to by the president.
That's very concerning, obviously.
David, did you hear anything today that might be concerning in regards to the president trying to prosecute him?
Katie, I think we just saw a redux today of Trump's playbook in these kinds of tweets that are not thinly veiled directives to the Attorney General of the United States and his personal attorney, Todd Blanche, the Deputy Attorney General, to investigate and bring charges against the president's critics and perceived enemies. And it's going to find the same fate, if that proceeds, that has been seen in the prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James so far. They'll be dead on arrival as classic instances of vindictive prosecution. The president can't restrain himself from speaking in the ways that he did today. It's precisely the kind of fodder and evidentiary ammo that a defense attorney, was keen to get in front of a court to support a motion to dismiss on grounds of selective prosecution. And with some increasing success.
He was also asked today about what he would worry about come the 2026-2028 elections. And he said he wants people in positions of the DOJ who are nonpartisan actors who adhere to the law. That's a question I would ask of you as well, given what we're witnessing with this DOJ and the president's not so thinly demands by his attorney general to prosecute the people that he believes have wronged him. What are you expecting come the midterms? What are you expecting come the next presidential election?
Sadly, I'm expecting the president of the United States to do everything he can to subvert free and fair elections in November. He hates to lose. I don't think he could bear the prospect of a Democratic-led House of Representatives that has subpoena power, the power to launch impeachment proceedings if it wanted to, and he has no guardrails. I mean, at least 4 years ago, there were some guardrails, but now there are none, except for, federal judges, many of whom have done the right thing and not allowed this kind of authoritarian abuse to go unchecked. But it's not about winning cases, of course, for this president. It's just about inflicting harm and havoc on individuals in our country and on the Constitution. So I expect the worst is ahead. The worst is ahead, and all bets are off this November. So all of us who care about the rule of law, who care about a pluralist democratic society, have to do everything we can peacefully to mobilize for that prospect and make sure it does not eventuate.
What about the ranks at DOJ? Not the political people, not the people who, there's been a lot of folks that have been fired, but are you confident in those who remain?
I'm confident in the willingness of career people to continue to do the right thing, even when they put themselves in harm's way. There is indescribable demoralization of the workforce. Career attorneys throughout the department, including the National Security Division where I worked, the FBI. What I worry about is agents and prosecutors declining to take on hard cases because of what they have seen befall their colleagues, many of whom have been fired or mistreated, relegated to backwater operations of the Justice Department or the FBI. And that chilling effect is hard to measure, but we're hearing more and more about it. Of course, they're not going to be asked to take on positions that prosecutors like Jack Smith and his career team would, because they're not going to be allowed to take on any cases that are adverse to this president, including holding him in check the way they would hold any office holder in check if they violated the rule of law.